Our next set of fallacies are going to be fallacies of misinterpretation. In these fallacies, one has to misinterpret or misrepresent the premises in order to reach the conclusion. Now, a lot of these arguments are actually going to be a little bit hard to parse, because when making an argument like this, one is often trying to hide what one is doing. So in some cases, we're going to have to look at the argument really carefully and try to figure out what the conclusion is even meant to be. Like in this first example. So we're given two statements here that are actually both premises. So the first premise is that the judge said televising the trial would not be in the public interest. But, claims the person making the argument, the public is very interested in viewing the trial. And the conclusion this person would like us to draw is that therefore we ought to televise the trial. Those other two statements, both of the statements that are actually presented in the argument, are premises. This is something we often see with logical fallacies, where we're just presented the premises and asked to draw our own conclusions. Okay, what is wrong with this argument? Well, in the public interest, that's kind of a set phrase. That has a specific meaning. What in the public interest means is it's good for society, it's good for the public. And that meaning shifts in the second premise when it says the public is very interested. That's using that in the standard sense of just interesting to the public. The public wants to know about it. So the fallacy in this argument relies on shifting the meaning of that key phrase, public interest, public is interested. That key term has different meanings in the two premises, which is what makes this argument fallacious and what makes this an example of equivocation. The shifting meaning of a term. If you want to identify an argument as equivocation, you need to identify what term or phrase has had its meaning shift. Okay. Now, this next example is a very famous example. If you've ever heard of logical fallacies, you've almost certainly heard of this one. And this is kind of a debating fallacy, either a real debate or a situation in which one person is arguing against a position that someone else was arguing for, or for a position that someone else was arguing against. So the setup for this example is that person A and person B are having a debate. And again, our conclusion is kind of hidden from us. So person B presents, person A thinks men's pay should be cut, but I think everyone should get paid the salary they negotiated for. And person B's conclusion is that person A is wrong. But notice what person B did here. Right. Person A said that women's pay should be equal to men's, and person B chose to construe that as person A thinks men's pay should be cut. That's not what A said. There are lots of ways to accomplish the goal that A sets forward. But person B chose to understand that in the worst possible way. In a straw man argument, one says one argues against a straw man when one makes up a weaker version of an opposing viewpoint. So I think these people should be paid equally becomes I think that the people who are currently paid more should be paid less. That's a weaker argument. So the idea of arguing against a straw man is you can't argue against your opponent's position, so you make up a weaker version of it to argue against. Okay. Our last fallacy of misinterpretation is another famous one. So, in this argument, the conclusion we're trying to draw is that all math teachers are extremely polite, which I think we'll all agree is true, regardless of the fallacy in the argument. And there's just one premise here, and that is, if you think you've ever had a rude math teacher, they're not a real math teacher, just someone who happens to teach math. I think it's obvious to all of us what's wrong with this argument. This argument is called No True Scotsman because it was originally posed by some British philosopher or other in the 19th century. And the conclusion was about how all Scotsmen did such and such. And that long convoluted premise was about how, anyone who didn't do such and such wasn't a true Scotsman. So, in the No True Scotsman fallacy, we want to claim that every member of the group has some property, and to do that, we exclude any member of the group that doesn't have that property. Now, looking at it in this context, it's obvious what's wrong with this argument. But be on the lookout for arguments of this kind. One actually encounters them a surprising amount in the wild. And it's actually a lot more comfortable to believe these arguments when they're about members of a group that you're also part of.